Nearly 1 in 3 American babies are born by surgery. If you were born in a U.S. hospital, one doctor's opinion from over a century ago may be why. America spends more on childbirth than almost any wealthy nation on earth, and still has the highest maternal death rate among them. This is the story of how that happened. Picture Chicago, 1917. A woman goes into labor in her own bedroom. Help arrives in the form of a midwife who has attended maybe 100 deliveries in her life. No white coat, no monitor, no chart. This wasn't unusual. In 1900, midwives delivered about half of all births in America, and fewer than 1 in 10 births happened inside a hospital at all. Home birth wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was simply how birth worked. In almost every American household, rich or poor. But home birth in 1900 carried a number nobody printed on a birth announcement. In 1900, roughly 850 American women died for every 100,000 births. 3 decades later, that number had barely moved, still 600 or more, regardless of whether the baby was delivered by a doctor or a midwife, in a hospital bed or a farmhouse kitchen. Infection killed most of them, in an era before antibiotics existed to fight it. Nothing about where a woman gave birth changed that risk. By the 1910s, pain itself became the fight. Groups of American women, mostly urban, mostly well-off, began traveling to Germany for something called twilight sleep, a mix of morphine and scopolamine that erased the memory of labor completely. In 1915, they organized as the National Twilight Sleep Association and pushed American hospitals to offer it. Doctors mostly refused them. These women wanted control over their own births. What they got instead, a few years later, was a decade of medicine deciding what that control should look like, and it wasn't what any of them had asked for. And the midwives who had delivered half the country's babies in 1900 were already losing ground of their own. The midwife who had helped deliver that Chicago mother's baby in 1917 was already part of a shrinking profession. By 1930, midwives attended less than 15% of American births, pushed aside as physicians campaigned to make birth a medical specialty rather than a household skill passed between women. By 1920, birth in America stood at a fork nobody could see yet. Twilight sleep had already faded. The drugs were simply too dangerous to standardize. But the appetite it revealed never disappeared. Women wanted birth to be safer, more predictable, less left to chance. That appetite finally found an answer that year. Not from a woman, not from a midwife, from a single paper written by a man who had come to believe that birth itself was the danger. Joseph DeLee had seen the worst version of childbirth up close. Early in his career, he worked at a Chicago charity clinic for poor, unmarried mothers. Women with no prenatal care, no clean facilities, and attendants trained past only the basics. Babies there died of preventable brain injuries far more often than they should have. DeLee built his entire worldview from what he saw at his hardest cases and never widened the lens past them. In 1920, he published a paper called The Prophylactic Forceps Operation in the very first issue of a brand new medical journal. His argument: birth wasn't a normal, healthy process that occasionally went wrong. It was, in his own word, pathogenic, dangerous by default, for every woman, every single time. His solution: sedate the mother the moment labor began. Cut an incision to widen the birth canal, a procedure that would later be called an episiotomy. Pull the baby out with forceps, on a schedule, before nature finished the job on its own. Not for high-risk births, for all of them. That single recommendation, an incision and forceps for every routine delivery, helped shape standard obstetric practice in America for the next 50 years, long after the specific technique fell out of favor. DeLee wasn't trying to control women, and he wasn't the villain of his own story. He had watched infants die of brain bleeds that a faster delivery might have prevented, and he built a system meant to stop that. But the picture he built his rule from was the minority of hardest cases he had personally witnessed, not the millions of ordinary births happening quietly and safely in American homes every year. Somewhere in Chicago, that same 1917 mother had no idea a paper like this existed, or that it would one day decide how her own daughter gave birth. That is the moment birth in America stopped being treated as something that mostly went fine and became something medicine assumed would go wrong until proven otherwise. The paper made no headlines, but federal health records confirm what happened next. Through the 1920s, forceps, episiotomies, and other surgical interventions in ordinary births increased sharply across the country, and the number of mothers dying did not improve at all. But here is what nobody expected. Making birth safer on paper didn't make it safer in practice. Not for years. Hospitals filled with laboring women, following DeLee's model of sedation and forceps,
to lock them in the depth of the womb.
And for 2 more decades, the number of mothers dying barely moved. Something else had to change first, and it had nothing to do with anything a doctor did inside a delivery room. By the 1930s, hospitals had already won the argument, even without better outcomes to prove it yet. By the time that 1917 Chicago mother's own daughter was old enough to have children of her own, this was the only version of birth most Americans would ever know. Walk down a maternity hallway in 1935, and you'd already see it filling in. 37% of American births happening there that year. By 1940, it passed 50% among white mothers, though far fewer black mothers had that same hospital door open to them. Just 9 years later, 87% of American mothers were giving birth behind those hospital doors. Nearly every delivery in the country, inside a single generation. What finally moved the maternal death rate wasn't the hospital walls themselves, it was sulfa drugs, developed in the 1930s, which for the first time gave doctors a real weapon against the infections that had been killing mothers since 1900, in hospitals and homes alike. The hospital didn't make birth survivable on its own. Antibiotics did, more than any other single factor, alongside safer blood transfusion and better trained hands. The hospital simply happened to be where those advances came together first. By the 1940s, the daughter of that Chicago mother from 1917 gave birth herself, inside a hospital, exactly as DeLee's model prescribed. She labored in a shared ward alongside other mothers, then was moved alone into a small, silent, sterile room to actually deliver, sedated, her arms sometimes restrained, a mask over her eyes to block the light. When she woke, a nurse placed a baby in her arms. She had almost no memory of giving birth at all. It was, in its own strange way, close to what those twilight sleep women had asked for 25 years earlier, just delivered by a system that had made the decision for her, instead of with her. 88% of American births happened in a hospital by 1950. A decade later, that number reached 90%. Home birth, the default for nearly every American mother 60 years earlier, had all but disappeared. Today, walk onto an American hospital's labor and delivery floor, and you will find DeLee's assumption still running quietly in the background, monitors humming beside nearly every bed, birth still treated as a medical event by default. In 2024, just over 75% of the mothers in that room chose an epidural. Roughly 1 in 3 left through an operating room door instead of a delivery room. A cesarean rate of 32%, up from just 5.5% in 1970. The World Health Organization considers a cesarean rate of 10 to 15% medically ideal for a population, roughly 1 door in 8, not 1 in 3. America runs at more than double that figure, and climbing again after briefly falling in the 2010s. And yet, the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of any wealthy nation on Earth, nearly double the average among comparably rich countries, even after moving almost every American birth into a hospital. For black mothers specifically, that rate runs more than 3 times higher than for white mothers. More machines, more monitoring, more surgery, and on this one measure, America still trails nearly every country it likes to compare itself to. A quieter countercurrent has been building since the 1970s, when a new generation of women, echoing those twilight sleep activists decades earlier, pushed to bring midwifery back into American maternity care. That countercurrent would have looked familiar to the midwife who once delivered babies in living rooms like that Chicago bedroom in 1917. Regulation slowed the revival through the 1980s, but it never disappeared. Birth in America did get safer, but not for the reason anyone at the time believed, and not nearly as completely as the promise suggested it would be. Antibiotics genuinely saved lives, and medicine deserves credit for that. But a great deal of what changed after 1920 was never about survival at all. It was about one physician's belief that birth was inherently dangerous, applied to every mother whether she needed it or not. We built an entire system around that belief, and by some measures, we're still waiting for it to fully deliver on its promise. Today, the great-granddaughter of that 1917 Chicago mother has a choice her great-grandmother never had. She can walk into her own birth with a written plan, a doula beside her, and the standing to ask why before agreeing to any intervention at all. More American women are choosing exactly that, and out-of-hospital births, while still rare, have been quietly rising again for the first time in a century. The story of childbirth in America was never really hospitals versus homes. It was always about who got to decide. And that question isn't finished being answered yet. If this changed how you see something as ordinary as being born, that's exactly what Health Evolution TV is here for. The story behind the things we take for granted,